Bonjour, this is Madame Gibbons, and this is the third and final part of the review of Passé Composé video sequence for French 4 honors and above. So this last section is going to be about reflexive verbs, or les verbes réfléchis. Just a quick reminder in the present tense of how we use reflexive verbs. So you recognize them by the se in front of the infinitive when you're looking at like a vocabulary list or in the dictionary. And what that's an indicator of is that the action of the verb is reflected back to the subject. So if we sort of look at it, if you imagine the action of the sentence is moving from left to right, just like we read. So the je is traveling towards lave, okay? But this reflexive pronoun, that is a signal that the action laver is returning back to the je, okay? So in this case, je me lave, I'm washing myself. Okay, so it's always reflected back to the subject, back to the doer of the verb. Okay, se lever, tu te lèves. Se regarder, il se regarde. So there are verbs that can be reflexive. There are verbs that are only reflexive in French. So like se regarder, you know regarder, you've used it since French 1. It can be reflexive. Il se regarde, he's looking at himself. Okay, but we also can use that without the se, okay, all the time. So that's just a quick recap of what reflexive verbs are in the first place. And then the thing with reflexive verbs is they're also going to use être, because if we think back to the second video about transitive versus intransitive verbs, or verbs that have an object after them and verbs that can't have an object after them, the reflexive verbs are kind of one of those special exceptions because they don't quite fit into the subject-verb-object pattern. We put them with être. So if we look at this, you have your reflexive pronoun, so me, te, ce, nous, vous, ce, just like you would in the present tense. Then you have the verb être in the present tense, so suis, est, some, et, sont. Notice that it does contract, so when you have tu, t'es, il sait, elle sait, on sait. Okay, participe passé, nothing special here. It's the same kind of rules that you use for all the different avoir, être, irregular, regular, anything else that applied. So I just put a few examples for you there. And then we are going to do agreement here. Okay, so since we're using être, we're going to do agreement. So if we're saying elle s'est lavée, we're going to add an e because it's elle. If we say nous sommes endormis, we're going to add an S or maybe an ES if I'm talking and I'm only talking about a group of women or girls. The one exception in this case, though, is if we're talking about something you're doing to your own body part, okay? So in this case, elle s'est lavé les mains, we're not going to do the agreement. So even though it's elle, because les mains comes after it, we're not going to do the agreement. And it has to kind of do with the fact that even though it's a reflexive verb and it's sort of in this weird category, the one exception to the putting a direct object after the verb rule is if it's the subject's own body part, it does make sense for it to be reflexive and yet still have an object after the verb. So that's why it kind of gets a special exception. Okay, and then that's what this looks like in the negative. So we're going to put the ne pas around the reflexive pronoun and the verb être and the auxiliaire. So, je ne me suis pas levé. I did not wake up. Okay, or did not get up, rather. Okay, and so that's it. Everything about the passé composé has been covered in these 3 videos with 2 exceptions. So one of those is the usage of the passé composé versus the imparfait. The other is agreement with the participe passé even when using avoir. And that's kind of a special advanced topic that I'm not going to get into right now. But if that's something you want to kind of learn about on your own, I would suggest looking that up. You can just search l'accord du participe passé avec avoir. And then just a brief summary of passé composé versus imparfait. I always say the best way to learn this is not to memorize a list of rules, but to just learn the feel of the verb. So if an event happened in the past and you would say it with a snap, it's passé composé. If an event happened in the past and you would say it more with sort of an arc motion, that's the imparfait. Okay, so I went to the store yesterday. That's the one that makes sense. Okay, because if I try to force it into this gesture, it just doesn't really make sense to say, I went to the store. It just doesn't fit. But I was going to the store when I met my friend. That makes more sense. So, j'allais au supermarché in the imparfait quand j'ai rencontré un ami. Okay? So that's just a brief summary of the passé composé versus imparfait. We can get into that more in class. Merci.